Danny here with Question Pro. Today we have another exciting episode for MRX Unplugged. This episode is called What Should Researchers Know About the Employee Experience? And we're joined by some wonderful, knowledgeable people. So we'll start off with our co-host here, Crystal, Dan, and then Sonia. So Crystal, introduce yourself, please.
Hey guys, I'm Crystal Weiss. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Question Pro, and I tried to fix my ponytail, but it seems to have gone crazy. Welcome to this episode. We're happy you're here.
I'm Dan Fleetwood, President of Research and Insights here at Question Pro, and excited to talk about this subject today.
And hi, everyone. My name is Sonia Lucina. I'm the President of Employee Experience at Question Pro, and the special guest that is super excited to talk all things employees, culture, and the like.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us today. I've been part of the market research side for quite a while, so I'm excited to learn other parts of Question Pro. So the first thing that we want to talk about is obviously the intersection between market research and employee experience. So I'll start off with Sonia. I'll ask you a question. So in your experience, how do market research techniques translate into understanding employee sentiment?
Yeah. So I'll give you a super quick background that you totally didn't ask about, but I think could be relevant.
It could be relevant, yeah.
So my background is I'm actually a psychologist. I'm an organizational psychologist who studies human behavior. And my first experience with Question Pro was actually I was a client in like 2007, 2008 doing market research on employee sentiment and experience. So I am like your use case on the intersection of the two. And at the time I was using the surveys platform, and I remember I was working with Vivek, our CEO, very closely because I think that, circa 2007, Question Pro was a startup back then. And I was working at Career Builder trying to understand all things that applicants and job seekers were thinking about. And so we took that massive, at the time, I think Career Builder had 20 million applications a month. We didn't survey all those people. We surveyed a sample because, you don't need 20 million people for
a lot of data.
Statistically significant. But then we took that information and we shared it with our clients to help them understand, hey, what happens before somebody joins your organization? And then they would look at that information, think about their employment brand, and also look at it in conjunction with their employee surveys to see, hey, is what's happening inside of our organization, are we effectively communicating our strengths? Is that resonating in the market? Are there certain things that maybe we're really amazing at and our employees love, but nobody knows because we're not effectively communicating it? So maybe it's not the most traditional career path, but I actually started my employee experience journey with market research and with understanding what's going on at a global scale, and then helping organizations use that data to make better informed internal decisions.
Very good. Couldn't have had a better guest for this one.
That's interesting. I think there is sometimes market researchers get very much we only survey about X, Y, and Z. Right. And I think sometimes you could definitely, how is consumer sentiment? We talk about that because I'm passionate about that. How does employee sentiment really drive your buying patterns, your, build patterns, your product development? And people really don't necessarily always combine those two.
Oh, yeah. And it's wild. So we just finished doing a market research study to help us. I'm your biggest fan, people.
Yeah, love it.
So one of the things we were just, digging in and writing about is we were looking at one of the questions that we kind of randomly asked at the end of the survey was we surveyed employees, around 5,000 around the US. And we asked hey, how often does your employer ask you about what it's like to work there? We try to make it very layman terms. It's not how often do you get an employee experience survey? Or so people would understand what we're asking. And what was, first of all, the numbers were staggering to me. And if you're interested, you can download one of our reports. I'll give you just the teaser here. But what was so incredible to me is, so Crystal, as Crystal was mentioning, we also have customer experience part of our business, and hospitality. For any of you that have ever stayed in a hotel or anywhere, almost right after you get a survey, hey, how was it? And hospitality was one of the industries that had the lowest rate of employee surveys. Mind-boggling. Like
Wow.
I'm
Oh.
seriously like sitting there still interpreting, writing up the data, because to me it was so shocking, just because again, the customer experience is so top of mind and so prevalent. So some of the things that we found is, the turnover rates are higher. There's not as much career progression, but we're also digging into the data to look at the differences. Like, hey, how does like the actual NPS score differ between companies who survey and who don't? What are the different, like, are there differences in experiences? And so to me, Crystal, to your point, it's really interesting how in some part of our business, we can think about like asking people is so valuable and getting their opinions on X, Y, Z, but sometimes employees like, meh. Maybe not. Who knows? So that's why I think like market research, especially is for companies that have that division, like, the strategies are very similar. It's not like, oh, the market survey, market research survey is going to be so different than employee experience survey. I would say in many cases, employee experience surveys can even be simpler and more straightforward because you can glean so much even just from the simplest questions. And so that's where I think market research teams can be so beneficial in helping collect that data, in helping interpret that data. And a lot of times it's not only about the collection interpretation, but we also know it's about storytelling behind it. And I feel like that's like one of the key strengths of market research. And still, I would say one of the bigger opportunities for HR, because a lot of times HR is so good at thinking about their world, their terms and how they talk about it. But then when you want to share that and have it really resonate and be impactful with somebody that's like outside of your department, that's where oftentimes there's a really big opportunity there.
We should do a whole episode on the language, like the cult language of market research and customer experience. And
the ABCs.
We're trying to be more inclusive. We want to be like in the organization, not left on the outside of it.
I was like meeting with one of our executives, Artie, and she was talking about one of our product lines, and she started using a language, like a term for the subjects inside of communities. And I was like, wait, so we call them subjects and communities, but we call them respondents and surveys. And then it's like talking. And I was just like, oh my gosh, of course we get so in our heads about using our language.
Yeah. In communities, they're members, not respondents, so.
Oh my goodness.
I know, crazy.
Different names for everything. That's crazy.
Like, oh my God. Anyways, that's
we need Brene Brown to do Atlas of the Heart for us. Atlas of Question Pro.
Atlas of Market Research.
A little booklet for us to have our own dictionary at the very edge of our desks. So Dan, going back to a little bit of the market research side, why do you think researchers should pay more attention to employee experience?
I think because it can tie in, right? And how the overall company is doing. And there's a product side as one of it, but if you don't have happy employees, I'm sure Sonia would attest to, it's not going to be good. So you need not only like good product sense, but you need a good employee sense as well. So I think the two are pretty closely aligned, and it maybe doesn't get talked about enough at least, but you want the holistic view, right? From not only your customers, your employees as well. So I think it's important. And you definitely want the happy employees so they can not only do the work, but then also you can probably triangulate that back to revenue at some point.
I would agree. And, I have some fun facts here as well. I mean, I think they're fun facts. So research from Gallup indicates that highly engaged employees are 21% more productive and 59% less likely to look for a new job. So we have some data to back this up.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of the basis that we've kind of provided for that understanding between market research and employee experience. Now, I would like to kind of see how we can measure that in our systems. So I'll talk a little bit about key metrics and insights. So Sonia, what are the most important metrics organizations should focus on when evaluating employee experience?
Love that question, Danny. And I think it's interesting because I was recently writing about employee net promoter score. And one of the things that's happened is increasingly we've had our customers come to us and say, how do I interpret this? Like, I got a score of a -10, like, oh my God, or I got a score of 20, like, is that good? Is that bad?
Mm.
And what's really interesting is that employee net report, like usually you ask agreement questions, or so you report on percent favorability or you report on a mean, right? And people are used to that. Like, oh, 75% of people are, have a good relationship with their manager. 50% of people like feel like they can take time off when they need to.
Right.
Means are maybe a little less common in business, like, oh, the, mean for like whatever, but it's still used. But then you get this number that's totally different than anything else you report on. Like, oh, our ENPS is like 30. What do you mean? Is that 30%? Like, oh my God.
I was a little confused.
Or you start getting into the negatives and it's like, wait, like, what? we lost the floor. What the heck does that mean? Now, what's interesting is that obviously, like maybe not obviously, but one of the reasons why ENPS can be really powerful as a part of research is that most executives, most CEOs, like anybody that's been in business for a while running a company is used to the net promoter score, right? You're used to that. How likely is somebody to recommend your product and service? So you're tracking that number and you understand it better. So it is one way for like employee sentiment and likelihood to recommend to like have this metric that's pretty well known by your leadership already. But you need to know how to talk about it, right? Because you can't like go in like terrified of like, oh, I have this like 30, is that going to be horrible? Not. So we did this whole guide around how to interpret it. So I would say that's an important metric that I would say even it's been around forever, but more organizations are using it. Now, here's the thing. Something I feel very strongly about is that you can't use it alone, because what's going to happen is you get a number and you have no idea why. Right? Okay. Like this is how likely I'm to, almost like in customer experience, right? Like, oh, I have a score of 30. I guess that's not bad. It's not great, but why did I get that? I have no clue. So what do I do with this? Now, for us, we built a framework. Like we did a lot of research around what do employees really value, what's important to them. And I'll tell you based on our market research and employer research that career progression, career development, learning is pretty prevalent in what people are looking for in a job. Right. So I would say that those metrics are really important to ask about. A lot around relationships. So that, I mean, pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID, I feel like it's still kind of chaotic, but I think that not only relationship with your manager, which I think is like what we talk about more in research, but also relationship with your colleagues and peers and how they show up and work. Those things are really important. Training and development programs. I think well-being is huge. I know DEI is controversial to say the least right now, but like, I'll tell you what, as somebody that's lived on 3 continents so far, many countries, and has teams all over the place, a sense of belonging, like it's just really important. Like it is, like it's important in life. I think it's important in business, whether you have your voice heard. So whatever you want to call it, making sure that people feel a part of your organization, I think is still critical. I'll say one more thing and then we can, turn the conversation is for what is important for organizations to measure, I think is also important to adjust based on what you feel like you can control and you can have an impact on. So we've had clients say, like, we really want to ask a few questions about compensation. And I said, listen, I understand that and I respect it. I will tell you one thing, that most people are not happy with their compensation. Like there's different levels. They might not hate it, but it's going to be one of your, lower scoring questions. I'll bet money on it. It's just what happens.
Sure.
Now, can you do something with that? So if I'm telling you that more than likely your employees are not going to be satisfied with their compensation, do you have the budget to make changes, or are you just collecting information to know how they feel? Because I'm telling you, it's going to make it worse. Like if you ask that and you can't do anything, just don't ask, because the worst case scenario, you're going to give people false hope.
Like
something's going to change. Exactly. And then you're going to announce your results. It's never going to be mentioned. What's the point? And so I think compensation is like the most stark example, but there are different things. Like if you ask about working arrangements, like, hey, like, do you want to work from home or do you want flexibility, but you don't plan to give people that, or you can't, don't necessarily ask about it. So
there's a lot of false hope there, right? If you're asking about it, but not going to do anything.
Exactly. So I'm not saying that every question, like once you get the answer, like you absolutely have to act on it and you absolutely have to act on it right away. Like there are always priorities. But when you're thinking about what's most critical, I would say look at what your organization's promises, look at what your values are, and look at what you feel like you can impact and focus on that. Now, the reason why I was mentioning like employee net promoter score is because oftentimes that can be used as an outcome variable. So if people are satisfied or not satisfied, that's going to impact the employee net promoter score. It's going to impact the likelihood that somebody says they're going to still be with the organization in 12 months or 2 years, etc. So I think when you're doing analysis, whether you're doing driver analysis or different things, like having at least a few outcome variables is really important, because if you're saying like, hey, like I want to retain people, asking them if they're going to be with the organization for another 12 months is an outcome variable. And if they, for those who are saying no, why are they saying no? What questions are scoring low on that, et cetera. So I think there's certainly no lack of options. It's more strategically thinking about what can you communicate to your broader stakeholder and executive team that's going to resonate with them? And then what information do you have to actually understand the why behind it and be able to take action on the information?
Sonia, you mentioned EMPS. Is there controversy around EMPS like there is NPS and CX? is that same level of like people like on both sides of the camp?
I think for those, like, I would say weirdly, maybe no, but I think it's also because it's not necessarily expected to be used. Like, I don't see people in HR that are like, we've got to do this. And somebody else is like, no, like, I guess maybe there's not as much controversy because there's not as much emotion.
Okay. That's a good point.
Is there like ENPS versus sentiment? Because that's what ours is always like. Customer sentiment versus NPS, or like the qualitative market researchers who are like, if you survey about these 9 things, like NPS is only one piece of that equation, but like the whole journey doesn't really matter.
Yeah, well, I think maybe less, because I think in customer experience, NPS for some people is more of like the be all and end all, which you don't get in employee experience. Like in employee experience, I feel like it's either a piece of a puzzle or it's not. But rarely have I seen companies, like they might have an engagement score, which would be a combination of different items that get scored together. But I'm trying to think, I really don't think any of our clients, for example, like rush to look at it, their EMPS as the main metric when the survey is done. Now, the controversy that I get in that I can talk about, forever is survey data versus behavioral data. So there is a camp now you can look at like how often people are emailing, when are they on Slack or Teams, like what are the exchanges, like all of this stuff. And there's a camp of organizations who are particularly focusing on behavioral data that are saying like, you don't really need to ask surveys anymore. You can just look at what people are doing. And do not even get me started on that.
That feels very stalkery.
Yeah, very big brotherish. For sure,
Point number 1, I know.
My Slack messaging has nothing to do with how productive I am. Let me tell you.
Oh, girl, there will be a camp out there that would disagree. I 100% agree with you. And so I think there are, like, we've worked with companies and we've partnered with companies, only the ones who also still believe in value of surveys, to look at the information together, right? To understand like, hey, when there's certain patterns and behaviors happening, like, can we understand the why behind it, where I think surveys really help. Now, it's not, I think that there's absolutely not one or the other. And like some examples that I would give is like, if you look at my calendar and it's packed, am I having a good day or a bad day? Like to your point, same point, Crystal, is Slack messages. Like I could have a packed day and I could be stressed out and burnt out and exhausted. Or I could have a packed day and I'm exhilarated and I'm excited because I'm doing the work that I love and I'm connecting with my team and thought leaders and people in different countries. And just by looking at that, you don't know. Like we were talking about computer tabs. I have a million. It's my happy place. Crystal like wants to, have a heart attack every time she sees my tabs. So her happy place and my happy place are different. And so if you just did that quantitatively, you would never know that. So I think that there's a place for both, certainly, but that I would say that that's probably more of a little bit of the controversy than, do we do? And now, and Crystal, to your point, sentiment analysis and open-ended questions, again, I think that's absolutely necessary, because if you just get an EMPS score and you don't know the why behind it, you can't do anything with it. Like maybe if you get a really high score, you can celebrate it, but you still don't know why. And so even if you get a high score, like, what do you need to make sure to continue to do well? Like what, because you're not like, I've never seen anyone get 100. I'll tell you that. Like all the industry research and all the company, like perfection, my friends, not possible. And so again, even if you're getting, 80s, 70s, there could be areas of opportunity, and there could be areas where you're consistently across departments, across regions doing really well. And you don't want to take your eye off of that, because if you do, your score will fall. So understanding where you're doing well and continuing to really lean into that can be as important, and as understanding your opportunities to improve and fixing those too.
That's interesting.
I did want to ask, so anonymity is one of the biggest contenders, I think, when it comes to surveys, be it whether employee experience or just market research. I guess this will be a question for both Dan and Sonia. How does it kind of vary, I guess, between market research and then employee experience, and then how does it kind of marry into each other as well?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. I think with anonymity, it's largely, I mean, one of the things you can preface any survey with, right, is like, hey, your responses are going to be looked at in the aggregate. It's not just you. So there's, by definition, there is. I think if you really, if you really want to keep it anonymous, there's ways that you can do it. A lot of it depends on the subject or the type of research that you're doing. But I think by default, if you're not collecting any, PII information, it's going to be anonymous. Whereas I think with Sonia, obviously, the employees, you're sending it out probably to their email address or SMS, whatever method. So I don't know. I think in research, it's a little bit different. It depends on like the type of study and the nature of it. But I can see an employee experience where it's probably tough to keep it anonymous, because if it's anonymous and you want to try to fix things, how can you do it with that particular person? But I don't know, Sonia, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, we actually get that question a ton. So Danny, I'm so glad that you ask. And it's interesting because there are different camps of organizations, and some that are saying like, listen, we believe in full transparency. We don't want to do anonymous surveys. But there are a lot that are like, you know what, I think if we don't make this anonymous, we just won't get honest answers from people, because they're going to be too scared. And then it's like, is it worth it to me? Right. So like, if I tell you my honest opinion, what are the chances that something's going to change versus that my manager's going to be really angry at me because now I'm saying that something didn't go well. Why didn't I bring it up with them? Why am I bringing in a company-wide survey? Now they're in trouble. Like, and so if you as a person think like, I really want to give candid feedback, but I feel like this could hurt me more than benefit me, you're not going to be honest in a survey. And so that's where I think organizations that sometimes feel like they have bigger problems, HR departments will lean more towards anonymity because they're thinking like, if people are worried, like if we don't have like psychological safety inside our organization or enough of it for somebody to really be honest with us, why are we doing this in the first place? And some of those things can be masked, like even if they're sent to email addresses, like when the response comes back, the email address is scrubbed, location scrubbed, and oftentimes actually, so for organizations that don't opt for anonymity, I would say just about all of them opt for confidentiality. And what that means is that when results are presented, you'll decide in a cutoff. Like if you're a smaller mid-size organization, maybe it's a sample size of 5. Larger organizations sometimes will do a sample size of 10. So if it's anonymous, it's kind of an extra protection. So somebody doesn't like, well, I'm going to reverse engineer this and see what Bob in marketing said, and I'm going to slice and dice this data. And like,
I'm going to track their open ends. I know how they write. And
I know, exactly. Like,
dude, I ran mine on this last Question Pros runs an employee survey every year. It's great. But there have been a couple years where I ran it through ChatGPT to rewrite it. I was like, I'm out of here. Like, I have a very distinct writing style.
Yeah, and see, and I think that's a phenomenal example because Crystal, I wouldn't describe you as a particularly shy or like, you know, person that doesn't speak up. And so even if you were giving that example of you like, hey, I'm going to tell you what I think, but I kind of rather not have it tracked back to me. Imagine how many people feel that way. Imagine how many people that are even more. And so there is actually quite a bit of that in organizations. Like what I would love, what would be, the rainbows and unicorns, is again that everyone has all the psychological safety in the world and we're always going to do good things with information. We're not there. And so, and that is what's interesting. And actually that's oftentimes what separates when somebody looks at Question Pro and some of like our competitors. A number of times we've been selected because of our ability to do anonymous surveys and because of our ability to be able to report data in a confidential way to really give people the confidence that this is not going to come back, to haunt you after you really pour your heart out to us.
I didn't realize that was a differentiator. Like I thought not everyone does it on an employee experience.
Me too. Me too.
It's not the industry standard?
No, because what happens is it depends on which organization. Some of the larger technology providers do have it, still not all of them. But as I was mentioning before, it is shocking how many organizations don't survey their employees. And so oftentimes what will happen is if they sometimes do, maybe they'll use like Google Forms or Typeform, or even like, I'm not sure if SurveyMonkey offers anonymity. I don't think they do. But so you'll kind of go from this like very kind of like manual strategy of data collection. And yeah, to me, I thought that was table stakes just because of how often it comes up, and it turns out that it's not.
Huh, surprising.
That would be like Sonia, if you ever have time in your product roadmap, like you could have like a rewrite your open-ended text with ChatGPT.
Oh,
that's a good one.
Feel more, if you like, I don't know
generic,
how to, like in a not sketchy way, but like to feel more, to feel even more anonymous, rewrite your
response.
I love that.
To make it generic, yeah. I mean, we've talked about how AI has kind of like turned everything into like this weird beige, mushy kind of sameness, and I mean, we could at least use it for good.
So one, I love that for the anonymity angle. And then of course, like my product development hat is one thing I've discovered is not everybody is a great writer. And so when we actually do analysis of open-ended questions, what happens is we do it with AI and you get some like weird classifications. You're like, why? And I'll go to the comments and I'm like, yeah, nope. Even with my human brain, I have no idea what this means. So what also, in addition to additional like anonymity, I wonder if something like ChatGPT could actually help kind of make more sense out of a comment. So it's like, not only are you feeling more anonymous, but then when the analysis are done, there's actually a comment that is a little easier to understand.
That's true.
And to be able to Crystal, that's brilliant. I will find some time in the
I just do it offline now. Like I just am like, but Dan, that also goes back to kind of that when you have when you're doing big data sets, even in market research or employee experience across, like we're a global company and we're not the only people who are. A great example is like I used a colloquial phrase called rolled back the other day, and someone on another geographical team didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes in those open-ended questions, whether you're in market research or in employee experience, if you could have an analysis or something that kind of beigeified our weird colloquialisms,
right,
you would actually be able to have better interpretation of your data.
Yeah,
which is good. And that's what we're all about. We are also all about leaving people with some really great advice. So now I have some questions about how we could, have real world applications for it. So, Sonia, can you share an example of a company successfully leveraging employee experience insights to improve workplace culture?
Yes. And this probably to none of you will be a surprise. Like World Market has become one of my favorite organizations because we have Eric Ortega, who leads their employee experience team, is just an incredible human being and somebody who's so invested in building a good culture there and understanding their employees. And we actually have, if anybody wants more information, we do have a case study published on this. But one of the ways they used employee experience surveys is to actually redo their values. And so their organization went through a lot of the change. They it was cost plus World Market. The organization divested. It went from being public to being private, like a lot of change was happening inside the organization. It was also around the time that COVID was happening. So
Oh no.
there were all these huge changes, and the organization said, okay, like we want to redefine our identity, who we are, how do we show up for our employees? And actually, as a part of that, they did an employee survey to get people's feedback about what they really like about the organization, what they want out of the organization, their understanding of different values. Like after they published their values, they also asked about recollection and how many people actually remembered what they are versus not.
Yeah.
And so to me, I think a lot of times when organizations do employee surveys, we think of this like, you have one big flagship employee survey, you ask about a lot of different factors, you analyze the data. It's very similar what we do internally at Question Pro too. But what I love about their use case is that they actually had a real organizational challenge, and they used employee surveys as this really critical input to solve that challenge. So it was a win for the business, but also imagine being an employee in the organization where they're saying like, it's not all of a sudden like these new values are just poof, this is what they're going to be. We hired a marketing firm, we talked to a few of our executives, but actually all of you were part of this discussion. This came up because this is what you really value. I mean, think about that.
Yeah, the buy-in is crazy there, right? Yeah.
Like, and how like just the attachment of the individuals, like how valued you feel, how seen you feel. Like there's all of these, in addition to actually getting really good data to make an organizational change, you're really positively psychologically impacting your employees. And retail is an industry that does oftentimes have high turnover rates and a lot of challenges. And so for them to particularly use it that effectively, like I'm so proud of that team. I think what they did is absolutely brilliant. And again, the fact that they identified a business challenge that they wanted to solve and then purposely used employee insights to gather information to solve that, I think it's just such a perfect example of how an organization can use employee surveys and voices to change the culture in the company for the better.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It should be. So Dan, this question's for you. What are some common mistakes companies make when conducting employee research, and how can they avoid them?
I don't know. I'd defer to Sonia on this one.
I guess maybe from like the technical end of it.
Yeah, I mean,
from market research,
Yeah,
They make their surveys too long.
Yeah, probably too long. I'd imagine. I think it kind of goes back to probably what Sonia was mentioning earlier, is like, don't ask about things that you're not willing to change in the survey. I think that's one of the things that at least I see when I've taken employee surveys, not necessarily at Question Pro, but when I've seen them in the marketplace too, is like, all right, if you take this, are you really going to take any action on it, or is it just kind of falling on deaf ears? So I think those are a lot of the things that I would at least think about, making sure that you're asking good questions. I know there's a lot of good templates inside of employee experience that we have and that you can make use of. So
Wait,
Crystal?
I have a commentary. Also, I would say if you are a market researcher, as most of our audience is, if your HR department, your employee experience department, or anyone reaches out to you for help programming their employee survey, help them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like, you are a market researcher. They are someone who's trying to advocate for you, but probably does not have a market research background. So help them program their surveys. As I was told in my second week at Question Pro, you don't need to use multiple choice for everything. Help them program their surveys, because Sonia is coming from a very unique background where she had that market research experience to program those surveys. But you have to assume if you've wound up in HR, you probably don't have that market research background, just like I didn't coming into marketing, and I had to learn it. So don't poo on them. Help them.
Yeah. I would say another thing is, after the results are collected, and I know, Sonia, you do a good job of this at Question Pro, is go back and let the employees know, hey, these are the results, these are the changes we're implementing. So that way it's full circle, right? And it's not just oh, I'm taking the survey, it's going to fall into the HR black box and I don't know what's going to happen. So reporting back on those results and what we're going to do about it definitely helps gain trust, I think.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought that up. So I'll make one comment on Crystal's and then expand on yours, Dan. Crystal, it was shocking to me how easy it is to write a bad survey question. I've seen the best, smartest people write the worst survey. And I'm like, dude, really? Like, double barrel doesn't make sense. Like all of that.
Mhm.
And so to your point, I think you don't have to get a PhD to know how to write a survey question. But to me, when I started working, it was actually really surprising how easy it is to write something in such a way that when you get the results, like you absolutely cannot do anything with them because of the wording of the question. Either people don't understand what it is, or it is double barreled, or
Mhm.
it's leading, or so that's why, to your point, I could not agree more. And Dan, my gosh, so when it comes to communicating surveys, so I've been like on my soapbox about that. I think that HR and communications and marketing departments have a huge opportunity to collaborate on that, because HR departments, again, are not always like the best, loudest communicators. Like, watch me
Right.
do this. They're more of
Mhm.
introverts. Like, I'm doing stuff. So now with that, I will not use the company name, but I was shocked. It's my revelation last year. So I go to a lot of conferences, and a few of them, like, people will share their company findings and like what they do with them. And it's very like private, internal, kind of stays between people. But some of these organizations, the extent of the number of people that work on analysis, the extent of number of people that take action on the data is impressive. I'm like,
Mhm.
wow, like you've made it. And so
Mhm.
there's one organization that I've consistently seen present at one of the conferences that I was like, you guys are doing all this right. Well, fast forward a few months, I was having dinner with a friend of a friend that works for that organization. We're talking about Question Pro and employee surveys. And she's like, you know, we do employee surveys in my company, but like I have no idea if anything ever happens with the results.
Mhm.
And my jaw just dropped, because I know from the HR perspective, from the people that presented, how much they do. But there is a huge break between what reaches the employees,
Oh, interesting.
Okay.
right? Because this one, I mean, it's sample size of one. So, like, I'm not saying like,
Mhm.
oh, they do a terrible job across the board, but this was a smart person.
Right.
So like, I'm assuming this person's not the only one. But again, like just how involved this organization is, how many ways they look at the data, the fact that they put it in the hands of every manager, the fact that they have initiatives, they measure initiatives, but there are still people outside of HR that don't know any of that is happening. So what's interesting is like, it's kind of like a funnel problem, right? You get the data,
Yes.
and then it's your
Mhm.
problem. There's plenty of organizations that end up not doing much with the data because they end up not having resources, or maybe the problems that they had are bigger than they thought and they're not sure how to solve them. And then one day to the next, like you move on to something else. And then there are organizations that really do something with the data, but are still not communicated effectively enough for everybody in the organization to be like, wow, I'm so glad you took these actions on what I said. And much like anything else, and all of us, probably everyone listening and everyone talking here knows this, when you do something, you cannot communicate it enough through as many channels as possible, as
Yeah.
often as possible, until people want to hear you no more.
It's true.
There'll
It's true.
still be somebody that says they never heard about it. But if that
Right.
sample is small,
Yeah.
you won. So I would say that's the one thing, especially for organizations that are doing something, like shout it from the rooftops, talk about it on every town hall, include it in your newsletters. Like, just assume that people are so overwhelmed with information that you have to communicate it from every way. Maybe they won't see everything, but as long as they at least see something that's being done with what they did, that's a win. So
It's something.
yeah.
Love it.
At least from some of the episodes that we've done already, there seems to be this common theme that we do all this work trying to get this information, be it from employee experience or market research, but as Crystal has lovingly put it, there's not enough whimsy when it comes to presenting it to the board members and packaging that information so that it is digestible and it actually gets the point across. So
Whimsy, really? You had to throw that in there?
it's the best way to put it, I think, because I mean, we could look at graphs all day, but if the story isn't compelling and if people are just kind of like diverting their attention away,
Mhm.
all that work really ends up not really being for much, unfortunately.
No. And that's why like less is more often, and then really knowing your audience, because probably what you're going to communicate to your executive team is going to be different, and in a different way they're going to communicate to your employees, right? Because maybe to your executives, you're going to communicate information that's going to be critical to the bottom line, or how does it impact operations, or how, but that same information you could be taking action on to tell employees like, hey, we're going to provide you these kinds of resources that you asked for. We'll provide this kind of upskilling, or we know AI is all the rage right now. You're asking for more training and development. So when you're talking to your executives, you can say, hey, do you know that only like 10% of our workforce feels comfortable with AI? And we've just implemented all these AI tools to make them more efficient. We need to bridge that gap, which is going to give us more efficiency, cost savings, et cetera. And to the employees, you're saying like, hey, this is good for you. It's good for your career. Both are true, but it's just you're using different language and different like impact statements in a way, depending on who you're talking to. So I think that is really huge. And I think sometimes, and I know I get caught in this because it takes thought and preparation. Like we tend to communicate to others the way we know it'll resonate with us. But not like almost like rarely does it, because a lot of times we come from a different perspective, whether you're in market research, employee experience, wherever you're coming from, things are impacting you differently, the people you're presenting to. And so you've got to take that moment to understand like what's going to be critical to them and how do I show up using that information and that language versus what I would be excited about if somebody was presenting this to me.
Yeah, makes sense.
I mean, you heard it here, folks. It goes across all boards. So that's our tidbit of advice here. So as we head into the final ends of this episode, do you guys have any last sage advice you'd like to offer to anyone? Definitely not fishing for a soundbite.
But I would say like also hold your employers accountable. Like if you take a survey, you should also be asking like, hey, we took this survey, what happened? You know, I would say employee experience goes both ways. To Sonia's point, I typically am not very afraid to ask what's going on. Like, but you know, I have a lot of psychological safety. You can ask my boss, Eric. I probably have too much, but it is like, if you're going to if they're asking us, just like survey respondents, like we reward them with a gift card. If you're going to ask your employees or your respondents for their time, make sure that you're giving something back in return.
Very good. Dan, Sonia?
Sonia, what do you have?
Yeah. I would just say like, stay curious. Ask, like, I think there's so much change happening everywhere globally, for every person, for every industry. And so I think today to keep that conversation open and understand and think, and again, give people psychological safety, whether it has to be anonymity, whatever shape it has to be in. But I think, especially in this moment, we can't be afraid to ask, because we need to know what's going well with people, what are their concerns that we can address. And so I think keeping that conversation open as frequently as we can, I think will be really important, because we don't know the rate of change anywhere right now, right? Like US, outside of US, like no matter where you are, the world around us is changing so much, whether it's AI, whether it's, you know, any other inputs. And so to not make assumptions on what our beliefs are, what our experiences are, but be open with the workforce, I think is going to be like more critical now than ever, to understand how to continue to make organizational changes and decisions that are going to be as aligned as possible with the needs of your employees. So I think that conversation is going to be absolutely critical, like this year and beyond. But again, like I think there are just so many moving parts this year that even for organizations that haven't leaned into it as much as they want to do or at all, I feel like it's going to become like table stakes. Like it's not like a nice to do, like, oh, we're going to, you know, we want to be super inclusive and listen to our employees. I think it's really going to be a business imperative.
I think it's important too, because the pace of change is like, things are happening so fast now, right? Like,
yes,
as opposed to even last year. So I think my advice, and I've said this before, is if you wouldn't take your survey, don't expect your respondent to either. And make sure you're asking good questions and that you would actually take the survey. Otherwise, it's going to be, you know, it's not going to be a good outcome for you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. I really appreciate it. For anyone watching towards the end of this episode, as always, you guys are my favorite people. Only the people that watch at the very end of the episode know that they're my favorite people. So yeah, I appreciate it so much. And hopefully I'll see you guys at the next episode. Everyone have a good day, okay?
Bye.